Good afternoon. My name is Juan Ignacio Figueroa, and I'll be talking about the Puerto Rican emigration to the US. Why are Puerto Ricans leaving? There are a various number of reasons why people are leaving the island. To name a few, I can mention the economic problems, cultural and political differences, people seeking better education or healthcare, fear of rising criminality, etc. In this presentation, I'll mostly be focusing on the economic aspect of this problem, since it's the most quantifiable. This presentation will provide some evidence regarding the amount of Puerto Ricans leaving the country by presenting graphs, maps, and tables provided by the US Census. This presentation will also present evidence as to why they're going and the difference in income between Puerto Rico and the United States. Information about the income was also provided by the US Census and other external sites which specialize in averaging prices and income levels in certain states or countries. In this table, we can see the total Puerto Rican population in the island in 2010. We can also see the median age and other details further dividing the population into more specific categories. But the important thing to take from this table is the individuals below the poverty level, which constitute 45.2% of the population. This is an enormous percent of people who are living under the poverty level, and it is bound to have a negative effect on the island as a whole. Criminality rises and economic growth stagnates as a result of this large amount of people living in poverty, causing people to look elsewhere for economic stability, namely the US. Now, this table demonstrates the population in the island and it's estimated until 2013. The tendency is for the total population to decrease annually. If we scrutinize the table a bit more, we can notice that in most age groups under the age of 55, the population is slowly decreasing, while the age groups of 55 plus are either remaining steady or rising. This means that the younger generation is looking for better opportunities elsewhere and is leaving, while the elderly are deciding to stay in the island. As more young people leave the island, the job market keeps shrinking, since eager, young people are offering their services elsewhere, and the elderly, who either cannot or don't want to work, stay in the island. Now, one might think that although many people are leaving the island, that maybe the amount of people coming into the country might balance out the ones leaving. Well, according to this graph, the amount of immigrants outweighs the number of immigrants in the last 2 decades. As mentioned before, this contributes to the loss of productivity and labor force in the island and keeps the population loss constant. This table here demonstrates the cost of living here in Puerto Rico and in the United States. The numbers marked in red to the far right of the table demonstrate how much we are overpaying here in the island compared to the United States. The green numbers signify the amount of money we're paying less compared to the US. Although there seems to be more green figures than red, the important rows we should look at are average monthly disposable salary and local purchasing power. As we can see, a Puerto Rican salary here is in the island is almost 50% less than that of a US citizen living in the States, meaning that we earn half as much as they do. As for local purchasing power, what this means is the ability we have to buy certain goods, whether they be necessity or luxury items. Since Puerto Rico's purchasing power is 30% less than the United States, that means we have approximately two-thirds of the purchasing power they do. Now, just to clarify, the reason we have less purchasing power than the US, although our prices do seem to be lower in the island, is because the difference between average salary is far too wide compared to the narrow gap between prices. The only significant difference is the rent prices, but one must take into account that in the US, this varies greatly from state to state, while here in Puerto Rico, the rent prices remain fairly static. Now, This is a graph from the US Census that details the differences in incomes for certain Latino groups and white non-Hispanics in the United States versus Islander Puerto Ricans. As you can see, throughout the last 2 decades, every single Hispanic group in the US earns more than the average Puerto Rican who stays in the island. Comparing it to the least economically prosperous group in the US, according to this graph, which would be the Puerto Ricans who are in the States, Islander Puerto Ricans have progressively been earning less throughout the decades, going from a gap of $2,200 in the 1990s to a gap of $20,600 in 2008. Associating this graph with the high amount of people who live in the poverty here in Puerto Rico, one can safely assume that economic growth has a major role in the immigration of Puerto Ricans to the U.S. from the island. As further evidence of the migration to the United States, we can see from these maps the specific states where Puerto Ricans communities have steadily grown for the past 2 decades. Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida have been most receptive of these Puerto Rican communities. As more states have a bigger population of Puerto Ricans, more islander Puerto Ricans will feel more incentivized to move to those states, since they can easily assimilate to that community and suffer a minimal cultural shock. Although the norm has been that for the last 2 decades people have been leaving the island, there has been a dramatic increase in immigration in the past 3 to 5 years. As mentioned before, the fact that certain states have seen an increase in Puerto Rican communities serves as evidence that people are moving from the island to the states. As introduced in the previous slide, in the past 3 to 5 years, the increase in immigration has been incredibly noticeable. As can be seen in the graph, the total immigration from the 1980s to the 2000s only adds up to half of the emigrated population from 2010 to 2013. Although the exact reason why there's been a sudden boom in immigration can't be known, one can safely assume that it'll be a long time before this problem gets better, and the effects that this will have on the island's economy will be devastating. Now, there has to be a steady job market to incentivize Puerto Ricans to either come back home or stay here on the island. To do this, one of the options is opening more businesses and providing more jobs in the private sector. By doing this, the population earns money that is not at the expense of the taxpayers, and therefore can then spend their own money, boosting economic growth. Also, by opening new local businesses, the money that leaves the country stays at a minimum. With new jobs in the private sector and more local commerce and business, less taxpayer money can be invested in governmental workers and can be reinvested in schools and hospitals. By doing this, we can address another problem which was previously and briefly mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which would be education and healthcare. Investing in schools and hospitals will also serve as an incentive to keep people here on the island and work both in the medical and educational field. Now, possible markets that could be focused on would be agricultural business and the pharmaceutical business. By producing its own food, Puerto Rico can stop importing food and cut those losses, and in turn can export the surplus goods to other neighboring countries, resulting in an enormous economic boost. The advantage of this is that it would all be local, meaning that most of the money stays here on the island. Puerto Rico has a huge amount of terrain that is currently not in use, which could be of great help for this new market. As for the pharmaceutical companies, these provide steady jobs for Puerto Ricans, especially those with degrees in sciences, namely biology and chemistry. Therefore, college graduates can stay in the island and obtain a steady, well-paying job which contributes to the economic growth of the island. These are just a few examples of ways we can begin fixing these economic problems. And although it's obviously more complicated than what's been presented in my presentation, This presentation is still a positive step forward in addressing the immigration problem we have here in Puerto Rico. Thank you very much for your attention.